Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in this talk about how to speed up writing tests with WireMock Spring Boot. This talk will touch upon WireMock, how to use WireMock with WireMock Spring Boot, and I'll wrap up this talk with some practical tips on how to speed up writing tests with WireMock. So, a little bit about myself. My name is PIETER-JAN. I'm a tech lead at Magna. It's an APAM company. I work there as a tech lead and as an expert in Adobe Experience Manager. I'm also a certified Adobe Experience Manager developer and DevOps engineer. And I also work on different Java projects. Now, before I want to start this talk, as usual, there's a disclaimer. So I will be talking about my experience on WireMock and how to use it in Spring Boot. I'm sure there are plenty of points for improvements. So I'm not claiming this is the way to speed up your writing unit tests. So let's get started. What I will be working with is a Spring Boot application that connects to the JSON placeholder API. That's basically a free API. And I connect to it, and I fetch some data about to-dos, and already have provided some unit tests. So I already prepared the unit test for my to-do client. I will not go into how to connect to the API, because this is not something new. I want to actually focus on writing the tests. So I have some basic tests prepared. So it connects to the API. It fetches a lot of all the to-dos, fetch the details about one specific to-do, creating a new to-do, and so on and so on. So the basic CRUD operations that each API offers. Now, the big downside of this is that it connects to the real API. So that means if JSON placeholder is down, the test will fail. Not because the business logic is faulty, but just because it cannot connect to the API. You also don't have any control over it, so if they decide to change the endpoints or the data they are returning, your test will fail again. And last but not least, if you want your unit test to succeed before you deploy your code, then you're stuck as well, because if the API is down, the build will fail and you will not be able to deploy. So that's where WireMock comes in. So what is WireMock? WireMock is actually a great tool that can provide mocked responses. So as a quick intro, I have two examples. This is the first one. So this is actually a WireMock mapping that mocks search results. So WireMock mapping always has two parts. One is related to requests, and the other one is related to the response, obviously. What's the deal with the request part? There you define what conditions have to be met in order for WireMock to return the response you want. So in this particular case, the URL path has to be /search !q equals mock, and the HTTP method has to be a get. And if those two conditions are met, then WireMock will send a response with status code 200. It will also contain a body stating here are the search results for the keyword mock. And it will also have it will also have a text plain content type header. So which requests will be matched against this? So the full URL will be matched, so a get of /search and so on will be matched. But the second one will not be matched because you are doing a post, and that doesn't meet criteria number 2, where we say method has to be a get. Or the third one will also not be met because the URL path ends with hello, and we wanted it to be mock. A bit more complex example is to check whether a given number is a prime or not. So again, we have a given URL path and a method, but you can also add some additional conditions with respect to query parameters. So in this case, I want there to be a number query parameter, and its value has to match this specific regular expression. That means it has to be at least 1 digit. So it's the same principle. When all these conditions are met, then WireMock will send a response back with status code 200. And in the mapping, you can also define a JSON body. So it's just a JSON object, and that will be returned as the response body. So in this case, a JSON object with one property is prime and its value is true. And the content type header has been set to JSON. So again, some examples. So the get is prime with number equals 1 to 3 will match because all conditions have been met. The second one will not return this specific response because the HTTP method is an option. The third one will fail because of the query parameter condition. It is -7, so it does not contain only digits. And the final one will also not match because the query parameter is just missing. So with that out of the way, we can now update the same unit tests, but we throw in WireMock with WireMock Spring Boot. Okay. Voilà. So how do you add WireMock Spring Boot? Quite easy. You add the dependency, and then the good point of this extension is that you don't have to fiddle with any additional configuration code. So what you actually have to do is spin up a WireMock server. Then you have to predefine your mappings, and then you have to inject it in whatever property you have where you define the endpoint of the to-do JSON placeholder API. You can do this with some custom code that has to be executed before the unit tests run, and that's actually what Spring Boot WireMock comes in. So you just have to add some annotations where you say, I configure a WireMock server with the name JSON placeholder, and whatever the host name and the port this WireMock server is running on, I want you to inject it in the property to-do API.url, and then this property is picked up to connect to the API. Next to that, you also have to add some mappings, as I've mentioned before. It has a very specific location under tests, resources, and then WireMock. And then you have to provide a folder with the name of your WireMock service. So I have the JSON, I've named it JSON placeholder. So you have a JSON placeholder directory, and under that you have two WireMock specific folders, __ files, and mappings. And mappings is actually the important one. There you have some JSON files where you define your WireMock mappings, as I've shown before. So for instance, this is a mapping to get the to-do with ID 1. And when the conditions are met, then we return this JSON where the user ID is 1, the ID of the to-do is 1, the title is Delectus Autumn, and it's not yet completed. A more complicated one is to get all the to-dos. So the JSON placeholder to-do API returns 200 of them. So you can imagine it's a lot of code to add just in the mapping. It would not be clear at all what this WireMock mapping is about. So there you can do a different approach. You just specify which file contains the body of the response. So in this case, I stored all the to-dos, all 200 of them, and this special file that resides in the other file, and that contains one huge JSON array with 200 to-dos. So let's see if the test still works with WireMock up and running. It should, because the logic hasn't changed. It just connects to WireMock instead of the real API. And you see all the tests are still running. And to prove I'm not cheating, I will disconnect from the Wi-Fi. There's also no network cable plugged in. And I will rerun the tests. They will not fail because of no connection or something like that, or server not available. And there you go. So that is proof that I'm using WireMock, not connected to the Wi-Fi or whatsoever. Now, for the next one, I want to drop in some third-party dependencies. In this particular case, Elasticsearch. So Elasticsearch is a database / search engine. And the cool part about it is that you can insert and retrieve information using a REST API. So it fits with WireMock, but the difficulty here is, among others, that we're dealing with a third-party library. So Spring Boot or Spring Data rather has an extension to connect to Elasticsearch instance. But this is a third-party library, so you have no idea what's going on. Behind the scenes, there's a REST API, and there's documentation available of the Elasticsearch API, but then again, it's very hard to find out what has to be exactly in the request and what will exactly coming back in response. And the third one is, you don't have direct access in the HTTP calls. So you can resolve these issues. There are certain ways. First one is just check the source code on GitHub of the Elasticsearch client, but it's very extensive. For instance, it's just the first page of the Elastic Client class, and you're still on the import statements, so that's not a route I wanted to go. A second solution is you can turn up the logging. In this case, the Elasticsearch library uses the Apache HTTP client, and I turned up the log level. So everything that happens will be logged in the logs. But then again, you have all the information, what the request and responses look like, but there's a lot to go over. For instance, you have a line saying, for instance, a head request has been sent to do. We have quite some headers on there, and then we get a response back and a 200 code. And if you have to come through the logs, that take a lot of time. It's cumbersome. You can make a lot of errors. So again, I'm not a big fan of this, but if you have to do it, you have to do it. But luckily, we have WireMock, and what can you do? You can do the man-in-the-middle approach with WireMock. So instead of connecting your Spring Boot application directly with Elasticsearch, you put WireMock in the middle. So what you now have is you have Spring Boot. It will connect to WireMock. For instance, it requests all the to-dos. And WireMock will save the request that has been sent by the Spring Boot app, and it will forward the same request to Elasticsearch. And then Elasticsearch will process these requests. It doesn't know where it's coming from. It actually doesn't care if it's coming from a Spring Boot app, Postman, WireMock. If it's a valid request, it will process it. And it will return a response with all the to-dos. But it will, since the request is coming from WireMock, the response will also be sent to WireMock. And WireMock will save the response and then forward it back to Spring Boot. So in the end, if you do all those calls, you have a nice list of, given a request sent to Elasticsearch, what is the response that Elasticsearch will reply with. And this man-in-the-middle situation is called WireMock record modus. So this is something that's available in the standalone WireMock. So you can not only use WireMock in unit tests, but you can also run it standalone. So let me switch to this shell. So what I will do is I will start WireMock in the standalone edition, and I will run it on port 9999. So it's up and running. So that's part one. So part two is I will connect. Let me first check out Elasticsearch code. So I have the Elasticsearch test ready. Again, Elasticsearch is running locally, just to make sure there's no trick up on my sleeve. So all tests are working just fine. This is now connecting directly to Elasticsearch. So what I have to do is I have to update the properties so it will connect to WireMock. So I started WireMock on port 9999. So I also have to update this. So that's part one of the man-in-the-middle approach. Second part is to tell WireMock to forward all incoming requests to Elasticsearch. There you go. So they have an endpoint, and there you just define what is the URL that I need to forward all incoming requests to. So in our case, Elasticsearch is running on local hosts on port 9200, and you hit the record button. So now, whichever request is coming in and the response that belongs to that request will now be captured and saved. So let's run the tests again. Unfortunately, it will fail not because of WireMock or Spring Boot. Well, my bad. I was jumping to conclusions. It will not fail because we are connected to WireMock. WireMock will connect to Elasticsearch, and so on and so on. Now, if we have a look what happened. So it's the same thing. So if you as you define your mappings, you have to save them under the mappings directory, but it works the other way around with when you're recording. Whatever mappings WireMock saves, they are stored in there. So if you go to the mappings folder, okay, I first have to stop the recording, so it will write. Of course, it's not working because I stopped WireMock already. So let's just redo it. So forwarding to localhost 9200, record, run the tests. Okay, we stop the recording. Well, it says it's captured 10 stub mappings, meaning 10 requests with their responses. Voila, so you see all the WireMock mappings that are available. Apparently 10 calls have been made. So what's the easy way to then include these in your tests? You can just copy them into your project under the right place. So let's go over it. So I already prepared the annotations. I've put them in comments. So it's very similar to the previous one. So I'm configuring a WireMock server. I called it Elastic, and whatever host and port this WireMock server is running on, I want Spring Boot WireMock to inject it in the elastic.host property. So I have, so I'll be copying the mappings generated by the recording on the wrong folder indeed. I have to paste it under Elastic mappings. There you go. So I will now rerun the tests with WireMock available, but it will fail not because of WireMock or Spring Boot, but because of a weird thing that relates to Elastic. So what will be injected, it will be http://localhost and then the port WireMock is running on, but Elasticsearch cannot deal with that because the HTTP, so the protocol, should not be in there. So I have to do it like this. So what I'm actually doing is I remove http://. Let's run the tests again. And there you go. So now the tests are again green, and they're using the WireMock mappings that were captured in the record modus. So let's go back to the slides. So in the end, to wrap this talk up, I'm a big fan of WireMock. I think it's a great tool. It has saved me many times during my development work. Also like WireMock Spring Boot even more, because it makes life really easy to just start up WireMock servers and inject the host and the port in the properties you need. What I also would suggest is, before you start feeling around with the record modus, is check WireMock library. That's, as the name mentions it, it's a library, and it already contains a lot of WireMock mappings for a lot of services that are available out there. So before you do it yourself, first have a look over there, search for the service you want to use and to mock, and odds are that it's already available. In case you don't find it in the WireMock library, you can just do it yourself with record mode. I think it's a really easy way to create those mappings without going through source code or through tons of logs. I didn't touch upon it here because yeah, it's not really in scope of this talk, but I also strongly suggest you check the response templating. What does this mean? The mappings I showed you now are always returning the same request body. But with templating, you can customize it. For instance, if you need mocking for a date and time service, it would be nice if the date and time you get back are correct. So what you can do is you can use some templating, and then on the fly, you can ask for the current date and time, and then that value will be sent back in the response. Now, as you've seen, WireMock itself is managed using a REST API. It can be quite daunting at first because yeah, it's not really verbose. It's a low-level approach to administering those mockings. But if you want something more visual, I can recommend WireMock Studio. It's WireMock, but on top it has a nice web user interface. You can define your mappings in a nice visual way. You have drop-downs to select the method, the request methods. You have nice boxes to add bodies. You have it's actually a nice editor to create those mockings. And it also supports a lot of imports. For instance, if you have a nice Swagger file of an API you need to integrate with, you can just import it, and then all the mappings are generated based on the content of the Swagger file. And if you do local development with WireMock, the standalone version, if you update or add new mockings, you have to restart it, or you have to reset the stubbings. So I can recommend, for instance, a watch exec tool. It monitors changes on the file system, and then in this particular case, I'm telling it to watch my WireMock mapping folder, and if something changes in that folder, I want it to do a call to the admin reset endpoint, so all the WireMock mappings are reloaded again, and I also want to print a date just to make sure that it has a confirmation that the mappings have been reset. So, in case you missed it, I'm a big fan of WireMock, and it saved me a lot of time. My productivity has improved a lot, and if you're familiar with the scale of WireMock, it has a rating of sharp. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, I see we have 9 minutes left, so feel free to ask questions now, or you can catch me during the week and ask me questions during the breaks between the talks. So any questions right now? Yep. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could run the recorder in sort of a headless mode, if you're not able to, like inside a container or something like that.
So your question, if you can run inside a container, you mean?
No, more like the recorder in a headless configuration, where it starts recording the moment it starts up, so to speak.
Okay. I see your point. So the question is, can you start recording once calls are coming in? It actually does that, but you need some configuration at first. You need to know where to forward the request to, and then indeed you have to push the button to start recording and then stop it. But somehow it makes sense to me that you have control when WireMock starts recording and when it stops. But I think you can override it, but currently it's not a feature. I thought there was someone else. Yeah.
Is it possible to have some placeholders inside mappings?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't catch the second part. Is it possible to
Have placeholders inside mappings?
placeholders and mappings? Yes, it is. That's the response templating I was referring to. So the date example I gave. You can add a placeholder where you actually call a function to get the current date and time. And whatever value this method returns, it will be put in the response body. So yes, there are what you can call value placeholders. I definitely recommend to check it out, because you can take values from carry parameters, headers. Everything that's coming in, you can be used as a placeholder. Yes? So the question was, can you add some plugins for instance, Google RPC? Or Yes, WireMock supports extension, and if I'm not mistaken, Google RPC is supported quite recently. I haven't played around with it yet, but I've seen a blog post where Google RPC is supported, and on top of that, I mean, GraphQL is also supported with an extension. I haven't played around with it, so I just know it's there. But yes, so extensions are possible, and Google RPC is already supported. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, can you also return error codes? Sure, you can. Just a disclaimer again, I did not prepare this, so this might go wrong, but it's possible. So for instance, let's go back to the test. I go to the to-do client, because I actually have, I think I have one. I don't have it, but I'm just going to for it on error. So the cool thing about WireMock is you have mapping files, but you can also add mappings with an API. So what I can do here is, I don't know it by heart, but I think you, so when you do a get / to-dos, let's keep it easy. Not with the request body, will return also not body, with header, and I think you can also do with status codes, and then you provide a status code, HTTP, what's it again, status, yeah, whatever, and then server or service unavailable. There you go. Then you get back a response with a 500 error code, and then it's up to check if your client handles this error case. Timeouts, it's possible, but I don't know by heart. I know you can do some delays, and you can mock some a big load, but I don't know them by heart because I haven't put it in practice yet. But I know you can mock this kind of behavior as well. So not only the positive cases, but the negative test cases can be covered with WireMock as well. I have time for one more question. I see 3 minutes in giant red letters. Going once, twice. All right, that's me. That's it for me. Thank you for joining me, and enjoy the remainder of the conference.